Hello, everyone. My name is Ileana Perez. I am the Director of Research and Entrepreneurship with Immigrants Rising, and it is my pleasure to get the opportunity to present our speaker and really expert on the topic related to the individual taxpayer identification number. We've been getting many questions related to the ITIN, related to new applications for ITINs and renewals, which is why we decided to invite Professor Lipman to be able to share lots of great information and updates related to the ITIN. But before I pass it on to Professor Lipman, I'm going to give a brief introduction. Professor Lipman is the William S. Boyd Professor of Law at University of Nevada in Las Vegas. She has an exceptional record as an accountant, lawyer, teacher, and a scholar. After working as a CPA in an international accounting firm and as the chief financial officer for a chain of retail jewelry stores, Professor Lipman turned to law, where she served as the editor-in-chief of the UC Davis Law Review and was recognized as an outstanding law student and a member of the Order of the Coif. Following a similarly stellar record in NYU's graduate tax law program, where she was a tax law review scholar, she practiced law with O'Melveny and Myers, LLP, and Irel and Manella, LLP. Professor Lipman joined the faculties of Chapman University School of Business and Economics in 2001 and the School of Law in 2003. Professor Lipman is an elected member of the American Law Institute, the American College of Tax Counsel, and the American Bar Foundation, and an editor and former committee chair for the tax section of the American Bar Association. In addition to this, Professor Lipman is always willing to answer my emails and many questions that I am unable to answer. So for that, I am extremely grateful. Professor Lipman, thank you so much for your time today, and you can go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Ileana. It is a joy to work with Immigrants Rising and to know that Immigrants Rising is out there as a safety net for so many individuals. Thank you for joining us this lunch hour, or whatever hour it is, wherever you are across the country. I do want to give a special shout out to anyone who is trying to get Nevada continuing legal education. And if you are, please make sure that you've registered with UNLV, and that if you have any questions at all, you send an email to Sandra Rodriguez at unlv.edu, who of course is the maven of all continuing legal education in Nevada through UNLV. In addition, I'm hoping, to the extent possible, make this a dialogue. And the only way you are going to be able to be heard on this webinar is by inputting some questions in the chat box or in the question Q&A box. So please do enter your questions at any time during this conversation. As many of you know, this is an incredibly complicated area of the law, the intersection of tax and immigration law. But it is unique. There are unique issues for each of you out there to try to think about. And so what I want to do is try to shape this conversation for each of you. And so the way we can do that is by you sending me questions while I'm talking, so that I can try to integrate your concerns into this presentation. So just so I make sure my Q&A box is working, I'm hoping somebody will just type in there, "Hello, Francine." So that would be great. As Ileana mentioned, thank you, Gabby. So nice to see you. Isn't it? It's fun to know that there are people out there. In fact, I'm noticing there's almost 50 of you out there. So thank you. And I want to open my email to each of you. So if you do have questions about ITINs or the intersection of tax and immigration law, I'm going to give you some resources in this presentation, but don't hesitate to send me an email and just ask ask me a question. So you've got my email address. It's francine.lipman@unlv.edu. So what is an ITIN? Well, an ITIN, first of all, the word ITIN is an acronym for Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. And it came about decades, began in 1996. The federal government pulled back. So this is during President Bill Clinton's reign as the president, and he was, President Clinton joined the Republicans and the Democrats in an effort to reduce welfare and push people to work. As a result of that, they started the federal government, Social Security Administration, was not going to issue Social Security numbers as liberally as they had in the past. And so someone had to just demonstrate that they were a US citizen to get a Social Security number. So I work with, and maybe Ileana does as well, and maybe some of you do, I work with individuals who are not authorized to work in the United States, but they have valid Social Security numbers. Those numbers are valid Social Security numbers with their name on them, but they are not valid for work. And they are not valid for Social Security benefits, including Medicare, even though these individuals have paid in and would otherwise qualify. They're only valid for Social Security benefits and Medicare if they are a US citizen. So it is already the landscape is confusing because people do have Social Security numbers that are their own, but those are generally issued in the early 90s or before. So now you cannot get a Social Security number unless you are authorized to work. The federal government, realizing there are a lot of people who are not authorized to work in the United States, do have a tax filing obligation. So in order for anyone to file a tax return, you have to have a taxpayer identification number. Not only do you have to have one, but if you're filing jointly with a spouse, that spouse has to have one, and any dependents, qualifying dependents. So anyone on a tax return has to have a taxpayer ID number, and if you don't qualify for a Social Security number, then you may or may not, if you have a tax filing obligation, qualify for an ITIN. So who are ITIN holders? Well, an ITIN holder could be somebody who lives outside of the United States, but has invested in the United States, and so has US source income, so they have to file a tax return. So they need a taxpayer identification number. So there are a lot of foreign investors who have ITINs, who are not physically present in the United States, not allowed to work. In addition, as we know, a lot of folks who are in this country who are maybe entrepreneurs or working, in order for them to file a tax return, they need an ITIN, or dependents on the return would need an ITIN. Dreamers currently qualify for work, a work permit, and so they have Social Security numbers. I get lots of questions now, as Ileana was saying, as people are concerned about dreamers potentially losing their work authorization. What's going to happen? My sense is, and this is unnavigated landscape, but my strong sense is once you have a Social Security number, you keep that Social Security number. You keep that Social Security number and you continue to use it. You're not going to lose your Social Security number, but that Social Security number might not be authorized for work. And so, but you would keep that number. You would not then apply for an ITIN. Now, as we know, a lot of dreamers had ITINs before they got their social security numbers. And hopefully they have contacted the IRS and let them know that ITIN no longer is relevant because I have a social security number. Or you can also work with the credit agencies to let them know to try to transfer your ITIN record perhaps to your social security number. But I do not expect that dreamers' social security numbers are going to go away. That is not consistent with what we've seen in this country before.
And Professor Lipman, I'm going to chime in briefly here. We're getting a few comments related to the term dreamers. I believe you're referring to DACA recipients who currently have a social security number. So I just want to make sure that that's addressed.
Absolutely, yes. And so as we know, there are folks who do not have DACA, and those are individuals who do not qualify for work permits or social security numbers, correct?
Correct, yes. And I believe sort of the dreamers is more of the umbrella term for both DACA and non-DACA recipients, but the differentiation is definitely specific to DACA recipients who were able to get social security numbers.
Exactly, thank you for that. So the underlying purpose behind the ITIN was that it was being issued for individuals who have a tax return obligation. So the federal government's position is if you do not have a tax return obligation, then we're not going to give you an ITIN. And it is also very clear that ITINs do not authorize an individual to work. And so it is what I would describe as an oxymoron to see an ITIN on a W-2, because a W-2 means you're an employee and you're not authorized with the ITIN. So ITINs cannot be used on a I-9 and don't authorize work. So the IRS has issued tens of millions of ITINs, but many of them have not been actively used on tax returns. As we know, there's about 10 or 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Nevada, where I had the pleasure of working and serving, has the highest percentage of undocumented immigrants of any state, but we're a much lower population state than California. So we have over 200,000 undocumented immigrants, and many of these individuals likely have ITINs. Again, as you likely know, ITIN holders, many think tanks and nonpartisan groups across this country have monetized the amount of taxes paid by ITIN holders. And just for state and local taxes alone, it was recently monetized. It's close to 11 billion with a B, not million, $11 billion a year in annual state and local taxes. In addition to that, individuals who are unauthorized, who don't qualify for social security numbers, pay about another $11 billion a year in social security and Medicare taxes. And then, of course, tens of billions of dollars are paid annually by unauthorized individuals who don't qualify for a social security number and federal income taxes. And so someone was saying that they have an ITIN and then they got a social security number, probably because of DACA, perhaps. And I do think it is a good idea to so with respect to the IRS, once you file a tax return with your name and social security number, we're hoping the IRS will then detach the ITIN. However, I do think it is a good idea to send the IRS a letter telling them that and they will, if your ITIN is not used for 3 consecutive tax years, then the government is expiring those ITINs or and deactivating them. But I do think it's a good idea. So it will happen automatically whether you let the IRS know or not. But with respect to your credit record, if you talk to these credit agencies, they often say that they don't collect data on ITINs, but I think I think they do. And so you could send them letters, each of the 3 big ones, and say, you want your ITIN credit record shipped over to your Social Security number. Perhaps you don't want that, but if you do, you might consider letting credit agencies know. The IRS will eventually expire your ITIN, but and connect your name with your Social Security number after you do file. So as you can see, this is incredibly complicated and far-reaching. So what is critically important, this is a big problem that we have with individuals who are entrepreneurial and trying to work, and that is that you have to have a tax filing obligation to get an ITIN. If you don't have a tax filing obligation, you cannot get an ITIN. And the federal government under this administration has made it increasingly harder to get ITINs, I would say. That has been my experience. So who has a tax obligation? Well, if you're a US citizen or a legally permanent resident, then you have a tax filing obligation if you, of course, you have income. Now, when we use the term resident for tax purposes, that is used differently than for immigration purposes. So you are a US resident if you are physically present in the United States. So the test for tax purposes to see if you're subject to federal income taxes, if you are physically present in the United States for a certain number of days. We count days. And so, by the way, be careful what you ask for, because if you are physically present in the United States for this period of time, then you are subject to US income taxes on your worldwide income. So US citizens, whether they're present in the US or not, are subject to federal income taxes on their worldwide income. If you are a resident alien in the United States, meaning a resident in the United States, physically present, but not a US citizen or a legally permanent resident, green card holder, then you are subject to US income taxes on your worldwide income if you satisfy this substantial presence day. And so we count days. Basically, it is if you are present in the United States physically for more than 183 days during a 3-year period. And so that we look at this year, the current year, and it's at least 31 days during the current year. And then we add the days from the 2 prior years. But what we do is we don't weight the days in the 2 prior years as heavily as the current year. So it's 1/3 of the days in the last year and 1/6 of the days in the second prior year. The bottom line for most unauthorized immigrants is that they are, as soon as they come to the United States and have been here for more than basically 183 days, they're subject to US income taxes. Why? We don't have a porous border. People aren't going back and forth. This becomes much more of a detailed analysis for a lot of our H-2B temporary workers. So I work with a lot of farm workers, and when they come to work, they actually have they get a social security number and they have a visa, but they're only here for a short period of time. So if they are not here long enough, then they're taxed as a non-resident, which means they are only taxed on their US source income. If you are taxed as a US resident, then you're taxed on your worldwide income. So for most unauthorized immigrants, because nobody's going back and forth, they are subject to US income tax on worldwide income. But as you can see, it matters when you come into the country. So if you come into the country at the end of the tax year, you might not be subject to US taxes as a US citizen that year. So it's a little bit complicated. So the Congress has really been worried about ITINs for a while. They're very worried about fraud. And so over the last almost 10 years, they have been trying to cut back on ITINs. And initially Congress said, and this shows you why it's so important for us to be loud and proud and have a voice in what's happening in Washington, D.C., because initially they were going to have ITINs expire if over a 5-year period. But that didn't happen. Then in 2014, they said, well, let's try and see, again, because this is because of advocates, let's only expire an ITIN if it hasn't been used in 5 years. I think that was a good resolution in 2014. Unfortunately, in 2015, Congress came in and they said, you know what? Any ITIN issued before 2013, which isn't that long ago, any ITIN issued before 2013, we are going to cause it to expire over a certain period of time, and taxpayers will have to affirmatively renew their ITINs or it will not be active. It will not work for filing a tax return. And so that's what we've been seeing since 2015. In addition, any ITIN that hasn't been used for 3 consecutive tax years expires. So that's where we are now, and we're getting toward the end of that cycle, and it has created a lot of mis and disinformation and confusion, and unfortunately a lot of expense for unauthorized immigrants who are having to renew their ITINs at a cost, which is unfortunate. So we're continuing to renew ITINs, and I'm going to talk about that as well. So this is how they were having them expire. They were trying to do it over a rollout period of time. And the bottom line now is ITIN, as you may or may not know, ITINs, the first digit is a 9. So they're easily identified. The first digit is a 9, and they are issued through a letter. So you get a letter from the IRS. They used to be issued on a card that was green and white. The government didn't want to do that anymore because they thought it looked too much like a Social Security card. And so now you get your ITIN in a letter from the IRS. So any ITIN with the middle digits of 70 all the way, we've gotten all the way through 87. So if your middle digits are 70, 71, 72, all the way to 87, those ITINs have expired by December 31st, 2019, unless you affirmatively renewed it. And if you affirmatively renewed it, you had to go through another application process, and you would get in the mail from the IRS a letter. It's a one-page letter that's very obviously says in bold letters, "We renewed your ITIN." So if you haven't done that, you need to do that as soon as possible. In addition, if you haven't used an ITIN for 3 consecutive tax years, then that ITIN, regardless of the middle digits, has expired. What they also were trying to do is, if mom and dad had ITINs and those had expired and the kids' ITINs hadn't yet expired, they were allowing everybody to file a ITIN application to renew them together. So even if those kids hadn't expired, they were allowing them to renew early. So this is important, and everybody's got to make sure their ITINs are renewed, or it really does put a wrench in your tax filing obligation. So as I said, if you're a non-filer, or if an ITIN hasn't been used, the government is going to expire it. And so what that means is, oh, how many digits does an ITIN have? That's a great question. And the question is, it has as many digits as a social security number. So 3 in the first bracket starts with an I, then 2 middle digits, and then 4 at the end. So on its face, it kind of looks like a social security number. It has the same number of digits, but always starts with a 9. And so for me, it's readily identifiable, and should be for you, because it starts with a 9. And I thank you for asking the question. I'm going to show you how you apply for an ITIN. I'm going to go through that process. So this is great. Thank you for these questions. It helps me realize you're out there and to get you involved. So if your ITIN has expired, or is going to expire. By the way, I expect more middle digit numbers to expire, and the IRS typically is going to announce that they typically announce it in May or June, what middle digits are going to expire for the period ending 12/31/2020. So for the end of this year, they'll let us know, and I'll let you know through all of our networks. Yes, this presentation is going to be available online, and it's also going to be, I think you will get a copy of it if you registered through email. So I get, the good news is these letters put people on notice, and what's really great about it, these letters come out in May, and so I often get contacted by people who want to renew your ITIN before it expires, as early as possible. Right now is not a good time to renew your ITIN. Why? It's tax season. The IRS is way backed up, and the ITIN renewal process is very manual. It's a paper application, and so it's not electronic. So it's complicated. So they do send out these letters. Do they send them to everybody? They try to, but of course, because people move, they don't always have the last current address. So if somebody hasn't gotten the letter, that doesn't mean their ITIN hasn't expired. So, but hopefully they get them, so that will tease them to do something. As you can see, not surprisingly, the top areas are where we have lots of immigrants. So how do you apply, or how do you renew an ITIN? How do you apply for, or how do you renew your ITIN? Well, it's kind of the same thing. So there is a form. It is a one-page form that you have to fill out, And you have to fill out this same form whether you're renewing your ITIN or whether you're first applying. And on its face, this form looks very simple. Any of you out there can Google it. It's a W7, W as in walrus number 7. And it is a one-page form that looks deceivingly simple. And it basically asks for your name. And I've got the copy of the, let's go to that. So here it is. If you Google it, it'll come up, but if it doesn't come up through Google, you'll see it at the IRS website, irs.gov, and it is a one-page form. And as I said, it surprisingly looks simple, but it is more complicated to try to fill this thing out. So one page, and as you can see in the upper right hand corner, there's a box, and that is a box that you need to check one of the boxes inside of it. And apparently this is one of the big errors that people make. They don't check either of these boxes. So you're either checking the box to say you're applying for new ITINs, so that means you don't currently have an ITIN, or the other alternative is that you're renewing an existing ITIN. So this is the same form that you would use to renew or to apply for your ITIN. Then on the next area, there's a whole bunch of boxes A through H, and you're going to check one of those. And this is the complication, I would say. So you're checking why you need an ITIN. And the federal government, as I said, they're not going to issue an ITIN to you unless you need an ITIN, unless they believe you need an ITIN for tax filing. Ileana and I and Catherine Ginn have gone around and around with this frustration, because to get the ITIN, you have to have a tax reporting obligation. So you can't get the ITIN before you have income. So many people want to get the ITIN to start their business and to maybe open bank accounts or get business licenses or other type of entrepreneurial activities, maybe get a taxpayer ID number for your business. Many people want the ITIN to start their business, and unfortunately, you cannot get an ITIN unless you have a tax reporting obligation, which means you already, are working or generating income through a business. So it's after the fact, and in fact, in order to apply for an ITIN, in 99% of the cases, you need to submit this one-page form with a tax return. So that means you have a tax filing obligation, and you can only get the ITIN with a tax return. So I work with a lot of individuals across this country, many of whom Ileana introduces me to, who have a myriad of different situations where someone says to them, you need an ITIN in order for us to continue to have a relationship with you. And that person doesn't have a tax obligation, so we can't file a request for an ITIN. So let me give you so I've had this conversation too many times, very frustrating for everybody. And so I will tell you about my most recent one. And that is a individual who was a refugee, and she was in the country receiving some assistance from a nonprofit she was a victim of domestic violence, and she was receiving housing and some training from a nonprofit that was trying to help her get back on her feet. Of course, that makes so much sense, to get her back on a path to healing. And the nonprofit was pushing her to get an ITIN, and they said, we cannot provide you with any more support unless you have a taxpayer identification number. Well, she clearly could not get a social security number at this point, and there was no way I could confidently file an ITIN application for her, because I knew it would be rejected. So it was not a good allocation of resources. So what I suggested to her was to have the people from the nonprofit contact me, have her introduce them to me. I am a tax attorney, I'm a CPA, I'm a law professor, and I have been thinking about these issues for a long period of time, and I can tell her and I can point her to the directions of the Form W-7 explicitly describe she qualify for an ITIN. So she did that, and I will tell you, the woman from the nonprofit did contact me, and I asked her to call me, and we had a voice-to-voice conversation, and then I sent her the links to the instructions for this form, and I think that was a very good way to try to work this situation out, rather than just trying to file for it and then having the IRS reject it and keep going back and forth. Just have a meaningful conversation. And I'm hoping, I haven't heard that it didn't work, so I'm hoping that that worked. So now back to these boxes. So there's many reasons, as I said, to get a taxpayer identification number. If you're a non-resident alien, and so that is someone who is not physically present in the United States, is not a US citizen, and they need an ITIN to get some sort of treaty benefit. So there are some people who are here on a visa who maybe are working as a teacher, but they're not a citizen, they're not counted as being physically present. They get treaty benefits, and they need to get an ITIN, and so they can check that box and get it. So I am looking at the questions. I apologize. So an ITIN is, an ITIN does not have the letter I in front of it. It has a number. So it looks very similar to a Social Security number, except the first digit is always a 9. And it does not have an I in front of it. And it does not come on a Social Security card. And it also is not issued by the Social Security Administration. It is issued by the Internal Revenue Service, and it is issued by the Internal Revenue Service solely to be able to file your tax return. And proof of income does not need to be, well, this is a good question from someone, and that is that in order to get the ITIN, you have to file the ITIN form with a tax return, which basically proves that you have a tax reporting obligation. And so, for example, if somebody right now is filing their 2019 individual income tax return, so in 2020, of course, we file our 2019 individual income tax return. So if you had income in 2019 and you don't have an ITIN or a social security number, you would now file that tax return with this Form W-7 and some additional documents I'm going to tell you about. You have to do it manually. You have to do it to a specific address. You don't file it electronically. You don't file it the typical address. You have to send it down to a specific address in Texas, and they will then issue you an ITIN, and they'll process that tax return with your new ITIN. See, because you're having to file a tax return without a taxpayer identification number, so you're going to have to do that manually. So these are excellent questions. Keep them coming. So back to this W-7 form. So the first box doesn't typically apply to any of our community. The second box, B, doesn't apply to our community either, because that's going to be a foreign investor who's not present in the United States, but they have US source income, and so they're going to have to file a tax return. So that's not us. Box C is typically us, and that is a US resident alien. So for tax purposes, this term is a resident alien is somebody who's physically present in the United States for more than 183 days, counted the way that I described it, at least 31 days of the current year, and then we count every day this year 100%. We count the years, the days the year before, only 33%. And then we count the days the prior year, only 1/6 of each day. And so anyone who is in the United States for more than half the year, 183 days, they are a US, who is not a citizen, who is not a legal permanent resident. For tax purposes, they are treated as a US resident alien. And they have to file a US federal tax return. And as I said, maybe be careful what you ask for, because if you are a US resident alien, you not only have to pay taxes on your US source income, but on your worldwide income. But that box C is typically the box that we check on this form. Then the next two boxes, D and E, I will tell you, after the current administration significantly changed the tax laws, those next two boxes have gotten more complicated. So this is box D and E. So you might need an ITIN because you're a dependent of a US citizen or a resident alien. So for example, if we have dad who is an unauthorized immigrant who's working in the United States, and he has children who do not qualify for a social security number, those children are dependent. If they live in the household for the entire year and they don't support themselves, he supports them. Those are dependents of not a US citizen, but of a resident alien. And so we would apply for an ITIN for them. And what has become more scrutinized is under the current form, it says you have to enter the name and the ITIN number of this person. So you would enter dad's name and dad's ITIN number. And it also asks for, the relationship. The W-7 form was just changed last summer, and it now asks for the relationship of the dependent. So if it's a child, you would put child. So someone is asking me, so it doesn't expire so long as taxes are always filed. That is correct. So if you are filing a tax return, your ITIN will not expire. However, if your ITIN was issued before 2013 and has the middle digits of 70 through 87, that's how the federal government identifies these ITINs, it has expired. And any ITIN that was issued before 2013 that doesn't have the numbers 70 through 87, it might be expiring this year, and the date it will that number will expire. We'll find out what the middle digits are in probably around May, maybe earlier. And those numbers will expire as of the end of 12/31/2020. So I don't believe they've gotten through all of the ones that have been issued prior to 2013. My experience is, because we have not had a porous border for so long, most of the people I work with that have ITINs were issued before 2013. So a lot of them, tens of millions of them, have expired. Can you use an ITIN to get a credit card? Well, I guess that depends upon the credit card company. I believe some individuals with ITINs are getting credit cards. That really is something, that's a private issue. That is a private contract with these banks typically. And so you can certainly try it. I know lots of individuals have, to the extent they have a credit record. So people have been doing it. Let's see, US resident alien is a very different term than I'm used to. That is true. I'm telling you, that is a tax term. So that is not the same as immigration law, but it is written in the tax code. So I'm using it as it's written in law. So in a U.S. resident alien is somebody who is a physical presence test. So we count the number of days you've been in the United States. And if you've been in the United States for more than 183 days in a 3-year period, counting the days as I described, then for tax purposes, you're a U.S. resident alien. And you would need to file a tax return. And if you don't qualify for a Social Security number, then you need to get an ITIN. And how do you do that? With this form and with a tax return. Folks who are, and quite often, sometimes this comes up if somebody is in removal proceedings and they need to demonstrate that they've been in the United States for 10 years. If that person is not a tax filer, we often work with immigration lawyers to file back tax returns for 10 years, and we have to get them an ITIN. Needless to say, immigration judges want somebody to file in a timely manner and pay all their taxes. And in fact, immigration judges that I work with, they look at tax compliance. That's why we encourage tax compliance. I know Immigrants Rising does as well. We encourage complete and thorough tax filing because we want you to be compliant and pay your taxes currently to the extent they're due. And immigration judges often look at tax compliance as good moral character. So that's important. So now back to this W-7. So if you are dependent, it's harder to get an ITIN, but you certainly do qualify. But you have to provide the name and the social security number or the ITIN of the person whose tax return you're going to be on, and then that W-7 form for the dependents would go on the tax return. Similarly, if you're a spouse, if you're the wife or husband of a US citizen that has a tax filing obligation, then you need to get an ITIN if you're going to be on that tax return. And the form asks for the name and the taxpayer ID of your spouse. And so if you already have an ITIN and it expires, you're going to use, and then you renew it, it's the same ITIN. You keep that same number. So that's another good question. So the boxes that I typically see our ITIN holders use are C, D, and E. A non-resident alien student, that's somebody here who's probably on a visa. And so that's not the community we're talking about. Other dependents, spouses of somebody. So I've worked with, in Nevada, we have often a lot of immigrants who come here to teach our K through 12 education, and they often have visas. They need an ITIN to file a tax return, but they're not residents. They're not treated as residents. So their kids need ITINs. So a spouse can get an ITIN if they don't have any income, if they are filing with their spouse. So, and they generally, if the spouse is not a resident of the United States, so if the spouse is back home in the home country, it is very tough to get an ITIN, but it can be done. And that spouse who's not in the US, if that spouse files with their US resident alien spouse, the spouse in the foreign country is saying to the IRS, I am ready, willing, and able to be subject to US income taxes on my worldwide income. So if you have a non-resident alien, in order for them to be able to file with a US resident alien spouse, they have to file a joint tax return, and the non-resident alien spouse has to agree to be subject to US income taxes on their worldwide income. So I'm not sure that that's the best idea, but in any case, those are the consequences. So the hardest part of this form is up there in that of trying to figure out which box to check. And if you don't check the right box, you could get rejected pretty quickly. The next couple lines are pretty self-evident. First name, middle name, last name. Unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of our immigrants have very long names and sometimes multiple last names. So this does become important to get it right. And what you want to do is we work very hard to make sure all these names and what boxes they're in, whether it's a first name or a middle name or a last name, we want to make sure, and this is, again, more challenging than it first appears, that it's in the correct order, that it's correctly spelled, and it's consistent with your passport or your birth certificate or your driver's license or your immigration card or your visa or any of your identifying or your marriage license. So I have worked with a lot of immigrants, and often, as we know, names, because people have multiple last names, they get confused on documents. And so think deeply about what names to put in what box here. So make sure it's consistent with those documents. And if somebody already has an ITIN and you're renewing it, make sure it's consistent with their current ITIN letter. So we want to, that's the hardest part about names. The next thing is their address. You put their current US mailing address. A foreign address. Most often the foreign address is left blank. I usually don't have a foreign address. Birth information, that's very important. The date of birth. You want to make sure you get that right. That is important information. And so this is a good question. Somebody's asking about proof of documentation. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Generally speaking, unfortunately, you have to submit original documents. The original passport, the original birth certificate, driver's license. I'm going to talk about the identifying documents. Unless you go to somebody like me, who is a certified acceptance agent and can authenticate documents so that you don't have to file originals. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but that's a good question because you can already see where I'm going. So birth information, put the person's birth date. Make sure you get that correctly. In some birth certificates, they put the year first, so make sure you get that correct. The country of birth. And then here, the city and state of birth, that's optional. So often I won't fill that in because it's optional. You have to put the gender, male or female, and then we get to the line 6A, the country of citizenship. So I just worked with some folks who were from El Salvador, so that's what we put down, their country of citizenship. Foreign tax ID number, often don't have that. I can't remember ever filling that out. I leave that blank. So that usually is blank. Type of US visa, if any, that is often blank. That is filled out for some of my teachers who are here on a visa. But generally for someone who is not authorized, they don't have a visa, so we leave that blank. So the only thing on line 6 that's filled out is the country of citizenship. Otherwise, everything else is blank. Now, your identification documents. So here, you're going to fill out whatever identification documents you're including. The best document to rely on is the passport, and it's got to be a current and a valid passport. So you want to, that's important that it's current and it's valid, and that's the best document to have because you only need one document. Any other document is not standalone. You need multiple ones. And so that can be frustrating if you don't have a passport. So what I do is I check the passport box or whatever relevant box, and then you fill out who it was issued by. So usually it's by the Republic of El Salvador or Mexico or wherever it's coming from. And then you fill out the number, the expiration date. And then this is often challenging to put on here the date of entry into the United States. So in many cases, people cannot remember the exact date. And so what I try, and the exact date, I've never had one rejected that said that wasn't the date. Likely the federal government doesn't have that date, but in any case, you want this to be consistent with any other documents you've filed. So I usually try to work with the taxpayer to try to remember what year. Usually people can remember the year, and then we try and remember, was it hot, was it cold, and narrow down to what month. And then I'll usually just put the first of the month if we can't figure out what day. And that is usually has not been an issue with taxpayers filing this. Then line 6E is, have you previously received an ITIN? And if it's a first application, then you just say no. If it's a renewal, then you say yes. If it is a renewal, then you fill out line 6F and you put your existing ITIN number. So that's why when I renew it, I have to have the prior ITIN numbers, because we want to renew that ITIN number. And usually it's not a problem to get that. Then, whoops, let's go back. So then and this is important under line 6F, you put a name that it was issued to. So if it was issued on a name that's a little bit truncated, then the name that matches the document, go ahead and put that name down. Or I guess if somebody got married so that their current passport has a different last name, you might put the passport and then the marriage certificate to try to explain why there's a name change. So that is it, except taxpayer has to sign this one-page form under penalties of perjury, so that we have the taxpayer sign this, and that is the whole form. That's it. It's one page, one size. But the harder part is the documentation. So what, in addition to this W-7, you have to submit authenticating documents to the IRS, and that means original or certified original documents. So what does that mean? That means a passport. So a passport so a passport proves your identity and also your foreign status. So the IRS says you have to prove that you exist and that you are not a US citizen or a US person. So the passport demonstrates that, but it has to be current and it has to be valid. And the good news is, I know in Nevada, we have had good success with our individuals getting current passports from the consulate, and they often are able to get them on a same-day basis. They make an appointment or they go in and they usually can get them if they have their birth certificate and other documents that their consulate requires. And I usually ask people how much it costs, just because I want to be able to explain it to people like you. And it does seem like it has been less than $200. So again, I'm sure every consulate is different and it might depend what kind of the length of the passport, but they have been less than $200 is my experience in Nevada. Now, if it's a dependent, then any dependent from a country other than Canada, Mexico, or of some military member that is overseas. So I've been working with a dependent from El Salvador, that their passport has to have a date of entry into the United States in order for it to be a standalone document. Often we don't have that, so it can be frustrating trying to demonstrate that dependents are trying to prove up a dependent's identity and foreign status. So for a taxpayer, the passport works for both. For a dependent from a country other than Canada or Mexico, you are going to need another document unless it has an entry date. So if it is a dependent that doesn't have an entry date, then you have to demonstrate they're here. So medical records, original medical records from a doctor, and that it's got to be dated, it's got to be current, it's got to show the child's name that ties to all the other documents. And then I have also used school records. So an official record from the child's school, obviously that's going to be someone who's in high school or younger, with their name, with their, I've worked with families to get their transcripts from the school, and we've submitted those to for ITINs. A dependent who's older than 18 and not in school, you can try and use bank statements or rental agreements or utility bills. What you're trying to do is you're trying to prove that they're here with a US address. Again, this gets more complicated and likely not going to be as clean of an application. So what are all the other documents if you have somebody who does not have a passport? Well, the good news is more and more states like Nevada are providing driver's licenses. And so if you have a US driver's license, then that can demonstrate your identity. A foreign driver's license, a state ID card. So if somebody doesn't drive, maybe a senior citizen doesn't have a driver's license, they can get, I know in Nevada, they can get a state ID number. If they have a military ID or some other picture ID that that can prove they identify them. Then for foreign status, we can look to citizenship and US citizenship and immigration IDs, visas, national ID cards, birth certificates. I typically work with a lot of birth certificates. If that birth certificate has been issued from a foreign country, then that's going to prove that they're foreign status. It can also identify them, but you need, again, 2 documents. One of the problems is if it's not translated, sometimes it does get kicked back. I have actually had fairly good luck with submitting authenticated foreign birth certificates, but you want to make sure that the names tie very clearly. So as you can see, without the passport, it gets more complicated to try to prove up somebody's identity and foreign existence. So what happens if you don't renew your ITIN? Well, unfortunately, you're going to know because can you use an expired US driver's license? Likely not. All of these documents have to be current, including the passport, and so they want current documents. So that is a good question, unfortunately. So get another driver's license with your picture and show that it's current. So if you don't renew your, so if you don't know if your ITINs expired or not, the good news is the IRS will let you know pretty quickly. They will process your tax return, but they will hold your refund. And so they won't they will receive it, so they won't return it to you and reject it, but they won't process it for a refund. So what they will do is they will send you a letter that says, we can't process your tax return because your ITIN has not been renewed, your ITIN has expired, and they will give you information on how to renew your ITIN. And they also will likely send you the W-7 and tell you you need to renew your ITIN. So if that happens, unfortunately, your refund is really going to be slowed down. And it could actually be worse than that, because you might end up owing. If you're not on the tax return, it might be processed as if you owe if you don't renew it. And so we've had taxpayers who never renewed, and their spouse ended up owing tax liabilities. And the government, if you don't renew within a certain period of time, they give you a specific time period. If you don't renew, they will start collections. They will start trying to get you to pay the tax liability. So you need to renew as soon as possible. And unfortunately, during this time of the year, during tax season, it's very slow to get your ITIN renewed. It's 9 to 11 weeks, whereas during the off season, it's about 3 weeks. Now, if you file original documents with the IRS, like your passport or your driver's license or your birth certificate, even though it's tax season, they say they will get your documents back to you within 60 days. So they're still, even though it might take longer to process, they're saying they will get their documents back to you within 60 days. I don't want anyone to send in original documents if we can avoid it. And so how can you avoid sending in original documents? Well, back to what I was saying before. You can use someone who's called a certified acceptance agent. That's someone who has been trained to look at documents and to authenticate them, to look forensically to see if something is a fraud. And so I happen to be a certified acceptance agent, and the good news is there's certified acceptance agents across the country who can verify your documents, who can authenticate them, so you don't need to send in originals. And what you need to send in, though, is you'll send in a form that they sign off on. They'll sign off on this form that says, yes, and I have my name on this form, and it says, I've authenticated these documents for this person, and I sign off on it, and that is included with your W-7. And if it's an application, that W-7 and the authentication documents, all of that has to be included with your tax return. So it's a lot of coordinating. How can you find out who is a certified acceptance agent? Well, the good news is the IRS website has a list of certified acceptance agent on its IRS website, and not surprisingly, it's based upon geography. I think it asks you for a zip code, and so then it can show you people who are certified acceptance agents in your region. Unfortunately, one of the problems with that is these CAAs often will charge for services, and I guess I don't want to be too upset with them charging, because of course, in order to become a CAA, you have to pay a fee, a licensing fee, and you have to pay for the training. And these people are often business entrepreneurs, so they do charge. The good news is some folks like myself don't charge, and so try to, so you might get a list of people, it'll have their phone numbers and such, contact information. So contact these information to see folks, to see how much they charge. Do that before you go to them, because some people say it's free, but then they charge you for other things. So go ahead and ask. I had some clients recently who told me, who came to me, they found me through the community, and they said that their tax preparer was going to charge them $180 a piece to renew it. So it can be quite pricey. And sometimes they bury it in the fee structure. So they take it out of your refund. So if your refund would have been $1,000, they say, oh, well, you're only getting $400 back because I'm going to take $600 to renew your ITINs and to prepare the tax return. So those charges are often buried. So I want you to be diligent about understanding how much people are charging you. Why do I want to? There's free FREE tax assistance out there for VITA programs, volunteer income tax assistance programs, that will often do tax returns and sometimes ITIN renewals. I know in Las Vegas we have CAAs like myself who work with groups who do tax returns. And so those VITA programs, volunteer income tax assistance programs, will prepare tax returns, often for ITIN holders, for free if your income is below a certain threshold. And the threshold is actually pretty high right now. It's about it's about 69,000, I think, is the last number. It might be 59,000. In any case, it's a pretty high number. And there's also free, if you already have an ITIN and your ITIN's been renewed, there's free tax filing software that you can use online from the IRS website. It's called Free File. So just go to the IRS website and enter in free tax assistance, and the Free File, which is online free software, a link to that will come up. You can't use that if you don't have an ITIN. You have to go to the face-to-face. But if you already have an ITIN and it's already been renewed, you can use this free online software and make sure it's free, and you have to enter it to be free from the IRS website. So I try to strongly encourage, and the IRS is trying to strongly encourage people to become CAAs to help our community renew and get these ITINs. And so you don't have to be a CPA, you don't have to be a lawyer. It's a little bit easier if you are, but we want more people to consider applying to become a CAA so that folks do not have to send in their original documents. So in order to do this, there's an application form on the IRS website. I've identified the form. This is a link to that. You have to take mandatory training, which I believe that mandatory training online is free. And then you have to attach this certificate that you took that mandatory training. And then you have to get this forensic training. Unfortunately, that forensic training does cost. And the application, I do believe, if you're not a lawyer or a CPA, they do ask for fingerprints. So they probably run it through the FBI's data bank. If you are a lawyer or CPA and have already been fingerprinted, like I have for California, as a California CPA or California lawyer, You do not have to be re-fingerprinted. And in order to remain active as a CAA, you have to have at least 5 W-7 applications or renewals a year. And how long does it last? That is a very good question. It is, so if as long as you're active and have at least 5 W-7 applications a year, then I know I got mine, if I remember correctly, it's about a 6-year period of time. This is the process to become a CAA. I believe the status is 6 years. What's interesting, I'm not sure at the end of the 6 years what the reapplication process is like. It might be exactly the same. Might have to pay a fee again. Might have to go through training again. I don't know, but it's at least 6 years. How often is the site updated, the IRS site? Certainly at least annually, because I know that it's really important that the VITA programs are updated before tax season. So, and that seems to be pretty consistent. The IRS really wants to provide this information because they know if people use these programs, it's easier for them to process the tax returns because they are done electronically, they're accurate. So the IRS definitely wants to encourage it. So I think it is pretty well updated. So additional resources about CAAs. The only real resource that I know is the IRS website, but they do provide you with the name and the contact information. So what you could do is you could Google the person's name and address, and then sometimes if these are paid tax professionals, they would be reviewed by Yelp or other groups that evaluate services. So maybe even Angie's List, I don't know, but certainly service providers are evaluated outside of the IRS website. The IRS is just telling you that they have gone through the training successfully. But I would definitely contact them to find out the cost and to make sure it doesn't have to be with the tax return. And if so, how much is that tax return cost? By the way, the IRS website also has not only free VITA programs listed and CAAs listed, but they also have tax preparers listed who have gone through the IRS training. So people from other cities have asked me for a reference for a tax preparer, a paid tax preparer, and there's a link on the IRS website that will give you, again, not really commenting, but will give you names of paid tax preparers who have a PTIN, which is a number issued by the IRS. So they have a list. Again, this is a good question. I would Google that person first because the IRS is not saying that person is, they're not standing behind that person, but they are saying that they have successfully applied, et cetera, et cetera.
Professor Lipman, sorry to interrupt. I do want to give you a quick time check that we have 4 minutes left in our webinar.
Fantastic, and that is exactly what I thought. So I am going to wrap up now and just kind of repeat where to get access to justice. So I've given you a lot of information, and the good news is the fantastic resource of Immigrants Rising website will have this taped, will have my PowerPoint. And not only do they have this information, but they have a plethora of other information. But the IRS website, they try to make it as easy as possible to navigate. You can Google VITA on the IRS website, free tax assistance, free file. You can also go on there to see where your refund is. I do it all the time for folks. You can also see where CAAs are. You can see where other paid preparers are. So you can get lots of information. And the other thing is they have in Spanish and in English information about ITINs, one-pagers, facts, frequently asked questions on ITINs. They have the form itself. They have the instructions. They have a plethora of information on there that they try to make as accessible in Spanish and in lots of different languages. Tagalog, Russian, Chinese, lots of information. So go to that IRS website. In addition, go look for low-income taxpayer clinics. There are low-income taxpayer clinics in almost every single state. These are lawyers that get a grant from the IRS to help individuals who have tax controversy issues. So these are people who are not helping you file a tax return. They are helping you if you get a notice from the IRS and don't know what to do. So those are low-income taxpayer clinics. There's a map at the IRS website that shows where they are geographically throughout the country. It'll link you to the LITC's website and you can contact them. Some of them cannot work with undocumented immigrants because they get Legal Services Corporation money, but many can. So I know this has been a fire hose of information to you, but I'm hoping it was helpful. And I really appreciate you engaging with me, because having that Q&A spontaneously was very helpful for me to realize you're out there and to understand what sort of issues you're worried about. Again, last thing, if you're trying to get Nevada CLE, continuing legal education credit, please do contact through email Sandra Rodriguez, sandra.rodriguez@unlv.edu. Thank you so much and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much, Professor Lipman, for all this wonderful information. I definitely feel like we should have, maybe a podcast or, some type of continuing flow of information and opportunity to do additional Q&A. So I can definitely follow up with you about that. But again, thank you so much for your time, Professor Lipman. Again, this webinar was recorded and we are going to be uploading the webinar, the PowerPoint slides, as well as a handout of important links that were shared throughout the webinar today. Thank you everybody for joining us today and have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.